All right, let's begin with the GDP data that came in earlier this evening at 7%. The first Advance GDP estimate released by the National Statistical Office is better than most expectations for the year FY23, which, remember, was a tough year all around, especially in the context of a war between Ukraine and Russia, which depressed investments, increased commodity prices, and saw crude shooting to record levels. Now, while the nominal GDP growth for FY23 is estimated at 15.4% versus 19.5% in the previous financial year, we are seeing that GVA estimates have been lowered and manufacturing sector's output has decelerated compared to last year. ET Now's consulting editor Maithili is here to give us her take on the numbers.
Well, the government's got some good news on the macroeconomic front going into the weekend. The first advance estimates released by the NSO, National Statistical Organization, for the current fiscal, that is 22-23. The NSO says the real growth will be about 7%, which is higher than what the Reserve Bank of India's estimate was at 6.8%. Better still, the nominal GDP growth and the nominal GDP number for this current fiscal is higher than what the budget had estimated. The budget had estimated that nominal GDP would grow at 11.1%. The actual growth is 15.4%. Given that the nominal GDP growth is what determines how tax revenues perform and ultimately how the government's fiscal deficit performs, this is good news for the government. Basically, what it means is that government's tax revenues are likely to overshoot the budget estimates, and the fiscal deficit, which is the excess of government expenditure over its receipts, is going to undershoot the budget estimate. As against the government's budget estimate of 6.4%, we could well end the year with a fiscal deficit in the range of 6.1 or 6.2. And that is very good news because it shows the finance minister has husbanded her limited resources very successfully. She's done a good job. Trust a woman to do it.
Most of the conversation in the beginning of January has been about what a gloomy year is looking like economically. A global recession seems very likely. It's upon us. We've already started with news about big job cuts in major companies globally. But what's the India story like? Well, we got a peek into that with the advanced GDP estimates for FY23, and they've come out better than expected at 7%. In fact, more than the RBI estimate, which had dropped it to 6.8%, more than the IMF's estimate, and even the World Bank's estimate that had increased it to 6.9%. So the first cut, because remember, this is just the advanced estimate, has come in at 7%. What it is showing is a picture of relative resilience. Of course, it's lesser than FY22. The war in Ukraine is casting its shadow over India as it has the rest of the world. We're going to talk about it today with a very special guest who is also here to speak about a very interesting book that he has co-authored. I'm joined today by KV Subramanian. He's the Executive Director of IMF, former Chief Economic Advisor and co-author of a book called Money, a Zero-Sum Game. We're going to be talking about all of that on the show this evening. Welcome, Mr. Subramanian. Great to have you on ET Now. Let me begin with your take.
My pleasure, Tamanna.
Let me begin with your take on the numbers that have come today, because you know you have always been known and everyone always looks forward to your view on the economy. And I've managed to talk to you on a great day where an important data point is out. So the GDP advanced estimate for FY23 at 7%. Is it a number that's sounding better than expected?
So let me, rewind you back, you and the viewers, Tamanna, to the times when a lot of questions were being posed about the Indian economy. You would recall, around before COVID, people were saying there is something structurally wrong about the Indian economy, that 4.5-5% growth is here to stay, that we are going to sort of hit this middle income trap, and after COVID as well, there were people who were basically predicted absolute doomsday for the economy. I think you would recall across all those interactions at that time, I actually kept consistently saying there's absolutely nothing wrong, with the Indian economy. And, whatever slowdown in growth pre-COVID had happened was because of the financial sector problems, and that India will actually register 7% plus growth this decade. And I said this, amidst COVID. I'm really glad to see, the economy indeed showing the signs of, optimism that I had expressed at that time. Do keep in mind, this is coming at a time when the, global economy is facing the twin, problems of recession together with very high inflation. In most of the advanced economies, inflation is between 2.5 to 4 times the historical average. In contrast, in India, the latest inflation print also was at 5.8%. That is actually less than the historical average of 7%. So, a relatively lower inflation, in the environment that we are in, together with 7% growth. I think, in a global economy which is going to be in recession, India growing at 7%, the fifth largest economy growing at 7%, cannot be, I think, better news for India and for the world.
I just want to take a minute more to go through the details. What picture that's emerging from the internals is that the farm sector continues to be resilient. The services sector has beaten FY22, but the manufacturing sector is showing a pain point with growth at 1.6% versus 9.9%. Does that continue to be a concern in the economy, manufacturing sector clubbed with private investment and the slow progress of private investment?
So I think, these are very important questions that you have posed. So first thing, let me talk about services. I think services was clearly the most impacted during the COVID period because of lockdowns and the, physical distancing that was required. So, services sector actually registering, upwards of 9% growth, I think is very good. That is actually showing that the, the concerns that were there during the COVID period, those are clearly behind us on the service sector. In terms of manufacturing, if you would recall, the numbers that came, the last quarter, together with the PMI index as well, I think clearly suggests that, going forward, manufacturing, will pick up. If you would recall, the policy emphasis clearly is on manufacturing. The PMI scheme that has been done, there's been a lot of, projects that have been announced as well. In Gujarat, for instance, we've seen some of these big ticket projects coming in. The government continues to actually keep its emphasis on infrastructure. So I think, while the number that has come, I think, is reflective of some of the global conditions, I would actually, be cautiously optimistic about manufacturing going forward. As for investment, I think, what we must recognize is that in any period of uncertainty, private investors typically stay in the sidelines, looking for uncertainty to get resolved, and then only, they invest, because investment is long gestation, and, involves substantial risk. I think, the combination of COVID together with the Ukraine war indeed actually, had created that, has created that period of uncertainty. But looks like the investors are slowly coming to grips with the new normal, and thereby, starting to think about investment. I think, this will accelerate going forward.
We are also speaking at a time when the budget buzz has begun. Obviously, a 7% is a great number for Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman to begin with as well. But this is being seen as a crucial budget for a couple of reasons. It's finally a complete post-pandemic budget. We've probably shrugged off those concerns. And it's the last full budget before the next general election. There are already questions about whether this will be populist, whether this will, want to woo various voter groups. Now, you've worked so closely with the government. Do you think that that's a sort of likelihood or a temptation that they will fall for?
I think the emphasis on growth in the budget will very much be there. if you look at the budgets that have been put out, in the last few years, there's been a special emphasis on capital expenditure. There's been significant increase in that. Even healthcare spending was, increased significantly. Many reforms, were brought in. For instance, the creation of the bad bank, the health increase in healthcare spending. I actually expect that in this budget as well, the emphasis on some of these core, policies for continuing to push growth, I think those will continue. As you rightly said, I have been fortunate enough to be working with some of the senior functionaries in the government, and if past thinking is any indication, I would actually think that the emphasis on growth, and especially through capital spending, at the same time doing it in a fiscally responsible manner, I think will be what we'll see in this budget.
One big challenge will be that though the Indian economy is relatively resilient, relatively a bright spot, but how do you shield economic growth in the midst of a global recession and a global slowdown, especially when exports, etc., will be hit? What would be your formula for Budget 2023?
So firstly, I want to answer this question in a very rigorous manner. I see a lot of commentary that is oftentimes just scratching the surface, saying, global recession, there'll be huge impact. I think, I always have believed in thinking rigorously about these things. Let's take GDP and its components and see which of these components will actually get impacted by global factors. So we know very well that GDP is basically consumption plus, investment plus government spending plus net exports. Let's look at each of these items one by one. Let's start with consumption. Consumption accounts for about 60% of the overall GDP in the country. And I think, you and Tamanna and the viewers will recognize that consumption is, mostly domestic. Only a small part of it is basically, is through imports. So that ain't, getting affected very significantly because of the global, factors. Let's take the second one. I'll come to investment last. Let's take government spending. As I just mentioned, that's first is a choice variable, and the government has been emphasizing, spending, especially on infrastructure, that I anticipate to continue. So I think that will not get impacted by the global factors either. Let's take net exports. I think there will be some impact there because the decline in exports, I think, will be more because of the global demand declining compared to imports. Imports will also slow down to some extent, but maybe not as much. So, your net exports will get impacted by the global economy. Lastly, if we come to investment, about 3/4 of investment is domestic, done by domestic players. Only 1/4 is done by the foreign, investors. While that might get impacted because of the global factors, the 3/4 is primarily domestic. So when you start, rather than sort of just speaking in the air, when you start thinking rigorously component by component, you start seeing that I think a lot of, these fears about the impact of the global, economy on India are overblown, and maybe not driven by rigorous thinking. So I think I would actually say that there will be some impact, obviously, maybe I think without the Ukraine phenomenon, I think we might have had possibly, excess of 7%, 7.5% growth. So there's some impact, but, certainly not the kind of impact that some of the fear mongering, is up to. So I think in that context, I think we'll go into this budget clearly in a healthy position. For once, I think, at least in my memory, I've been following the Indian economy now for decades. I don't see a period where the rest of the globe was in, such trouble, and India was such a bright spot in the economy. So let's celebrate that.
But, as much as we will celebrate it and we should celebrate it, the emphasis whenever this is talked about is on relative. India is relatively better than the rest of the world on the base we have. And the other argument is that for a nation like India, we need to grow preferably in double digits, at least above 7-8%, to make material difference to the people of this country. How do you reconcile that?
So I have a very simple answer for that. Even in absolute numbers, 7% growth is very good. And this is not because of a base effect, because, as you would recall, I wrote an article in the Times of India in September looking at growth over a 3-year period. India's growth over a 3-year period actually has been positive. So, it can't be and has been the largest among top 10 economies, and without the inflation that these economies are facing. So when you look at a 7%, growth in absolute numbers and inflation, which is basically within the range and, less than historical average, I think even on an absolute numbers, I think there is reason to celebrate. So I don't think we should basically just continue to push this argument, oh, it is only relative, to actually try and undermine what is, I think, good performance.
Let me come to your latest venture, your book, which you have co-authored, Money, a Zero-Sum Game, which has already been creating waves for some of the very interesting ideas in it. Now, from what I understand, and please correct me if I'm wrong and you must explain this, you are driving home the point that the policies that central bankers are using, the tools that they're using to contain inflation, for example, to push growth, for example, just don't work and need to be re-looked at. Do I have the gist correct?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, that allows me to share with viewers the origin of this book. Ever since the global financial crisis, my co-author and I, both of whom actually have worked, as bankers, and then, are economists now, we've been observing that central banks have actually pulled out, what many people have called these monetary bazookas, to try and stimulate growth. And there was more of the same during the COVID period as well. And yet, across the world, the growth stimulus really has not happened due to monetary policy, and I think so that left us wondering, why is it the case? So what we've then come to by thinking very rigorously and, from first principles, what we've come to the view is that the monetary theory that, leads to these prescriptions for monetary policy, that is flawed. I'll give you a sort of a parallel. Suppose, medical research suggests that, if you have a viral infection, that you should be given, antibiotics, and that sort of, let's say, the incorrect, or the flawed prediction that comes from medical theory. What will medical practitioners, doctors do? They'll basically follow that prescription and give, antibiotics for viral infections. The patient will not get well, but, the combination of maybe, the doctor's pride or, not communicating back to the researchers tends to then, continue the same. What we are doing here is basically backtracking and saying that if the patient does not seem to be becoming better, maybe there is something wrong in the theory that is predicting. And the key point we show, actually, which departs from existing monetary wisdom, is that banks are not financial intermediaries. Banks are money creators. And I think this is a very important point that has to be understood. The current wisdom, basically, and, including the Nobel Prize in Economics this year, takes banks as financial intermediaries. They basically take deposits and use those deposits to give loans. It's like they're passing the parcel. That's what an intermediary essentially does, right? They pass the parcel. Of course, with a small nuance, which is that they take liquid deposits and, pass them on as illiquid, illiquid loans. It's as if, let's say, think about taking liquid milk and converting into illiquid ice cream. That sort of, but it still is passing the parcel. The key problem here is that banks are actually creators of money in the economy, and they contribute almost 90% of money supply in the economy. The currency in circulation, which is what basically the central bank in any country creates, actually together with bank reserves, that is what accounts for what the central bank can control. The currency is only 10%, and going forward, as digital money expands, that proportion will come down further. So the proportion of money that is created by banks will actually only increase. The current monetary theory does not recognize this very, very important power that banks have. And that is why we've actually written this book, to essentially, by providing very careful evidence, laying out very careful arguments from first principles, what is the problem with the current monetary theory, and what is the right framework to think about money and monetary policy thereby.
I'm very curious to know how it has been received, because your book is coming at a time when we're seeing action from central banks all over the world, including in India, as a very crucial part of the puzzle on how to manage the situation. Whether it's inflation, whether it's, muted growth, etc. The first tool and what is considered as the most effective tool is monetary policy. And your book says that it's not working. I'm wondering how it's been received.
Well, firstly, it's early days. I think, if I go by, I put out a tweet, and put it on LinkedIn, and then, in just a few hours, the book went out of stock. So I think, overall, clearly, it seems like it's been received well. But, I think what is important is eventually the quality of the product will sell. We have thought very carefully, and we've written it for the average reader. As has been my want, I generally try to explain it in a way that even those without exposure to economics can understand, and that's the way we've written the book. At the same time, we've not sacrificed on any of the rigor at all, and we've provided evidence to actually back this. So I think, I'm very confident about the quality of research that we've put together in the book. Therefore, it will actually definitely, see good traction.
Just a question, when you're talking about monetary policy and the banking system, and this is sort of out of the field kind of question, but I think it's interesting in the days of digital currency, crypto, the basis of which is to supplant or bypass the banking system, in the belief that it's essentially flawed. And you are saying that the way monetary policy is being conducted needs a reboot as well. What do you think is the future of money and of banking in the context of this theory that believers in digital currency propagate?
So let me take a step back, Tamanna, and I think explain a key idea, in the book. The reason banks are money creators is because they, when they give loans, they create deposits in the economy. As I mentioned earlier, the current theory basically just, takes it as passing the parcel, which is, it is deposits, take deposits and give loans. So when you think about the direction of causality, it runs from deposits to loans. But when you, start thinking deeply about it and, use sort of the think from first principles, how does a bank actually work? We've worked in a bank and we've seen, therefore, how these things work. It is the lending division that, decides whether to give a loan or not. Suppose I approach, let's say, ICICI Bank for a loan of 1 lakh. They will be assessing whether I have the ability to repay that 1 lakh, whether I have the willingness to repay that 1 lakh. And if they think that, the answer is yes to both, they will, give me a loan, sanction that loan. When they sanction that loan, what happens? They're basically crediting my bank account with 1 lakh. So my deposit goes up by 1 lakh. So in the bank's balance sheet, what has happened? The loan has increased by 1 lakh. At the same time, deposit has also increased by 1 lakh. And, after explaining this conceptually, we also show evidence using demonetization and using, sophisticated econometric techniques, called Granger causality, to show that the direction of causality actually runs from loans to deposits, not deposits to loans. Just to illustrate this, if you, for instance, take the episode of demonetization, which is a clean natural experiment, what we economists call nothing else happening. If so what happened there was deposits actually increased by 8.5 lakh crores. If the theory of financial intermediation were right, there should have been an increase in lending. And yet what you find in the real world is actually loans decreased by 1 lakh. And that basically sort of clearly pokes a big hole into this theory that deposits create loans. Instead, it is actually loans that create, deposits. And as I just mentioned, 80% or more than 80%, 85% of overall money is deposits. So it is banks that are basically creating that, and banks are not going anywhere. I think they are the ones that are, creators of money. If anything, when, more digital currency starts coming in, I think the importance of banks will only increase. So, I think I'm absolutely convinced, given the power that banks have in lending, because they have the ability to assess the borrower's credit and thereby make the loan and create money in the economy. So I think the flaw that current monetary theory does is to actually minimize the role of banks. Instead, actually, banks must be thought about as the primary money creators in the economy, and thereby policy should be actually enabled for the same.
Well, interesting times ahead. Thank you so much, Mr. Subramanian, for joining us, and best of luck with the new book. That was KV Subramanian, a former Chief Economic Advisor and Executive Director at IMF, speaking with us exclusively.
Thanks.